So everybody, welcome to the Life on Mars podcast, the Mars-based podcast, right straight from Barcelona, connecting to the other side of the ocean, if not the other side of the universe. It's Martians talking to robots. Today, we have the pleasure of having here Chad Pytel, the host of the Giant Robots Smashing into Other Giant Robots podcast, brought to you by Thoughtbot, one of the most respected Rails companies. Actually, I've got two very good things about Boston. One of them is Thoughtbot. The other one is Dropkick Murphys. And I like listening to both of them on a daily basis. So welcome, Chad. How are you doing? Welcome to our podcast.
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to come from across the universe to smash into Mars.
Funny story. When we started I'm going to give you like some sort of an introduction, is when we launched the company in 2014 and I was for a brief amount of time living in the States. I sent an email to a lot of Rails companies, pretty much every goddamn Rails company in the entire world. And finally, only two companies answered. It was not a pitching email. It was, hey, can we meet? I'd like to know how the Rails world is. And one of these two companies was Thoughtbot. It was your former employee Adarsh in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. So funnily enough, we messaged, 500 companies in the Rails world, and only Thoughtbot and another one answered. So how cool is that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things at Thoughtbot that we do. And one of the things is like, we try to respond to everybody. It sounds simple, but that includes like when people apply to Thoughtbot, we really try to make sure that everyone gets a response, for example. And it's just, it's sort of like a treat others as you would want to be treated kind of thing. And I think that permeates a lot of what we do.
Yeah, and to give some context to people here, so Thoughtbot is a developmental product consultancy from Boston, although you have multiple offices around the world. So maybe you can introduce Thoughtbot a little bit before we go into the main topic of the conversation.
Yeah, we're a design and development, mobile and web product company. Consultancy. We work with companies of all different sizes. So brand new startups, much larger companies, even in the Fortune 500 and Fortune 50, right. And we do basically two things. We help people go from concept to launch of a new idea. So we help validate the idea, figure out what product it should be, and then launch it. Together, both design and development. And then because of our deep experience with Rails, with mobile, with design, we also get companies that have existing products and existing teams, and they come to us and say, we have this problem and we'd like your help solving it. And that can be scaling a team, scaling performance, best practices, launching a new mobile app. We help them do that. And that the biggest thing that we're doing oftentimes is working alongside of their team and actually improving their processes and their team while we're working together to solve whatever technical problem they have.
You created the company in 2003, actually. So you've been through maybe a lot of highs and lows. How does the pandemic have affected the company? So if at all, I don't know.
Yeah, we just celebrated our 17th anniversary in June.
Congratulations.
And you're right. We've been through a lot of ups and downs over the years. The pandemic pretty severely impacted our immediate, what we've seen, because it didn't affect, we don't have too many customers in the travel industry or that kind of thing. So existing customers were mostly okay. But what we saw was everyone that we were talking to about doing something new, about starting something new, put it on hold in February and March. And so we saw new engagements, new projects that we were doing completely seize up. And so that affected our sales pipeline and the new work that we were doing pretty severely. And for a little while, it looked really, really bad, to be honest. And so we made some very aggressive moves to shore up things and make sure that we were going to be able to weather what we saw. And fortunately, we've been able to do that. So now we're very stable and we're operating at sort of the new revenue levels. And we've started to see things pick back up. And so certainly a lot of those projects that were put on hold, companies have started to start either get them started or to start thinking about getting them started and restarting conversations with us.
Yeah, also over here we saw that how the sales pipeline dried up literally overnight, and right now we've been like the last 2-3 weeks it's been kind of like taking off again. So it's reassuring, and I hope that is also the case for you. So can you give a little bit of context as to how many employees you are, more or less, like the size of the company for people who might not be familiar with Thoughtbot?
Yeah, we are just over 100 people across 6 cities primarily. So that's Boston, London, UK, New York, Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, Austin, Texas, and San Francisco. And the way that we primarily have worked in the past, and the reason why we were those 6 cities, is that up until 2012, we were 19 people just in Boston, designers and developers, working with companies all over the world. But if we actually looked at it primarily in the Boston area. And we intentionally stayed that size because we didn't know how to be bigger and be the kind of company that we wanted to be. Not a lot of overhead, working directly with customers to create something great in a very authentic, true, principled way. And so in 2012, we were coming up on, we were a decade old, and we were really thinking, okay, we're in this for the long haul. Are we happy with the impact that we have? And we also had a number of people on our team that wanted to live somewhere else, and we didn't really have a way to make that happen. And so we realized, instead of thinking about how can we possibly be a 50 or 100 person company and be true to who we are, let's not worry about that. Let's think about how do we replicate what we have. And that was when we hit upon letting those people move and growing a new Thoughtbot studio around them that was a replica of the great thing that we already had in Boston. And so now, not everything's perfect, obviously, but we're actually striking a really nice balance where, for an individual designer or developer, it feels like Thoughtbot and what has made Thoughtbot great, a small cohesive team of people working together to create great products directly with a customer. But then you're part of something bigger. So you're in Slack and you're working across all of the studios on Thoughtbot open source and our internal tools and our culture and our principles and values and that kind of thing. But on the day-to-day product work, you're working with a small cohesive team of people. And we were pretty intentional about that growth, and it's worked pretty well for us.
So the reason why we're having Chad here today or tonight, I don't know what you're saying in podcasts when you refer, because time is a relative thing, right?
Yeah.
We're recording podcasts. So it's not only because Thoughtbot is the kind of company every Rails development company should aspire to be, because I think you guys are doing pretty great job in terms of culture, in terms of open source, in terms of sharing what you learn, your podcast, your blog, your everything. So thank you for that. Thank you for everything you're contributing to the community. But also because a lot of people have been asking me how to run a podcast. I don't know jack shit about how to run a podcast. We started last month, and I said, why don't I host one of my favorite podcasts? And so, Chad, thank you for joining us and for accepting this invite. You mentioned something very great here. It might be a coincidence, but you said when you were a decade old, in 2012, you started to expand. But coincidentally, that's the year you started your podcast as well. Was that a birthday gift, or was it part of your strategy of growing?
No, it was not at all strategic. We had been talking. I listened to a lot of podcasts.
Great.
I run long distances, and before the pandemic had a fairly long commute into the office, and so listened to a lot of podcasts and love podcasts. And so I had been wanting to do a podcast for a long time, but I didn't feel I had the time to be able to do it. And so in 2012, we actually had an apprentice, Edward Lovell, at Thoughtbot. And he also listened to a lot of podcasts and loved podcasts and that sort of thing. And so he really made the argument for us to get started. And I said, I totally agree. We should totally have a podcast. We should totally do it, but I can't host. Like I didn't start as the host of the podcast. Ben Orenstein did. So, Ben was a member of the team at the time. And so Edward and I went to Ben and said, we think you would be a great host for the show. I will sort of produce it. So I sort of lined up the guests and made the show flow and that kind of thing, and provided Ben, sort of feedback and that kind of thing. Edward did the early production and editing workflow, and Ben was the host. And if we hadn't split up the work that way, I don't think that we would have been able to make it happen.
Actually, yeah, it seems like it was an easy sell for them talking to the CEO to create a podcast because he loves podcasts, right?
Right.
It's not our case here, but I think it was more like an unintentional byproduct of the pandemic. But yeah, it's a great idea. So, but you said you were not there from the start. So how long did it take for you to think like, wow, we're nailing it, right? We're finally getting the right timing, the right frequency, the pace of the interviews or the talks or the content or the distribution platforms, the marketing. How long did it take till you actually thought this is becoming a great podcast? Because let's assume, I don't remember your first episodes, but most podcasts suck for like the first 10 to 20 episodes, right?
Yeah, it's funny because I don't want to say we got it perfect right from the beginning, but because there was so much sort of pent up momentum, because it was something that we had wanted to do for a while, I just had the vision for it in my head for a while, like even to the point where at the time there was another podcast, the Ruby on Rails podcast, and they would just talk about Rails news and that kind of thing. And we have a pretty popular blog and we have pretty popular open source. And so they were mentioning us so much, and our blog is also called Giant Robots Smashing into Other Giant Robots. So every time that they mentioned us or the blog, they would play this sound. It starts our podcast, the Giant Robots Smashing into Other Giant Robots. So there was a podcast that had they would put us all into a segment, and they had that audio. And I was like, you need to use that audio for our podcast. And so I asked them for permission to use it. So the show came together sort of really quickly, and but it started where we were mostly interviewing ourselves.
Yeah.
In those first episodes, which the audience liked because it provided a view into Thoughtbot and that kind of thing. But we only could get so much material on a weekly basis, interviewing ourselves and talking about ourselves. And so the show, I think, really came into its own once we really started to double down on having guests on a regular basis and not just talking to ourselves. And so that took a month or so before a couple months before we did that.
Because I don't know if you have the same situation, but for instance, we've been hosting events since the inception of the company 7 years ago, right? But they are not our events, so to speak, because we leverage another brand that's called Startup Grind. And therefore, whatever thing we're building there as a reputation and like me being the public face of the company is built on Startup Grind, but not on MarsBased, right? And after a few years, we realized that whenever we are speaking at an event, we're gathering large crowds. And it sort of dawned on me that maybe we should talk more about ourselves. Even if I'm interviewing you right now or other people, maybe in the future we'll be talking more about what we do as a company, but it's great to start talking with some other people and kind of like build your own brand as opposed to somebody else's brand, right? But I remember like your first episodes were perhaps because you were coming from the open source and your blog more oriented to developers. Whereas with the time you've transitioned more like to product, business, management, and of course you're a highly opinionated company as well as to how to do things right and all of that. So how did that transition happen? Was it because you thought like, hey, we need to justify the podcast by getting more leads or having other metrics and not just target developers? You didn't want to build the podcast for developers, did you?
It actually happened a little bit more organically than that, because what happened was we actually did launch a podcast for developers.
Yeah.
So it's called The Bike Shed, and it's at bikeshed.fm.
You're right.
And once we had that going, and so then very shortly after launching The Bike Shed, we also launched a mobile development podcast, which is no longer going, and then also a design podcast called Tentative, and that one's still going. It's tentative.fm.
Quite a lot of stuff going on.
Right. And so once we had mobile, sort of the web focused development and the design podcast going, that was when, it was a natural transition to have Giant Robots Smashing other Giant Robots be more focused on the product and business of software, because we had different venues for talking about, sort of deep design and deep development topics. Actually, and so it just naturally happened that way.
Yeah, well, I'm interested into that dispersion, because actually that's not usually how people tackle these kind of things. But speaking from CEO to CEO, right? People in your company pitch to you the idea of hosting a podcast. Whenever we are trying something new in marketing that requires an investment, it's mostly time. It's not like you splash the cash on Google Ads or whatever, and then you try to pump it up artificially. We believe in organic growth. You believe in organic growth, right? So it's mostly like, let's get something out there and try to nurture it and everything. But in terms of, you need to somehow justify your investment in terms of how many hours you invest into the project, how much you get out of it. Is that something you still calibrate, or how did you calculate it in the beginning? Was there some sort of ROI?
You give me too much credit. That's not at all. Most projects, especially successful ones at Thoughtbot, we didn't do that calculation.
You should talk to my partner then.
we did it because we wanted to do it. So we didn't view the podcast as a marketing thing at all. We viewed it as a project that we were working on, just like our open source projects.
Great. Yeah.
And so there was there's no calculation around marketing or return on investment, in the same way that we don't do that when we, work on a new open source project.
And how did you transition out of the multi-podcast model into the big podcast? So was it hard to balance? Why did you shut down the mobile one? And
well, we didn't intentionally shut it down. It's driven by the hosts, right? So the mobile one sort of just petered out because, a lot of the people at Thoughtbot are the ones on the show. And so, not everyone stays at Thoughtbot forever. And so one of the hosts left Thoughtbot to go join Square Cash as a mobile developer. And it was just hard to keep going at that point. We swapped in one of the hosts, and it was irregular, and they just decided not to continue. And it made sense. If you're not going to really be able to commit something and produce a quality thing, it doesn't make sense to continue it. We take the same attitude with our open source. We're pretty fair while being we're pragmatic about what open source we should be working on. So for example, when active support was clear that it was going to be in Rails and that it was an important part of Rails, and it was going to it made sense to think hard about where Paperclip, which was our file attachment open source, fit within the ecosystem, and where we should be putting our effort. And does it really make sense to actively compete against something that is in Rails if we want that thing to be good and we love Rails? And it didn't make sense. And so we deprecated Paperclip, despite the fact that it's a super popular open source project. And I think it makes sense to just think about community, think about what you're producing as a product, and try to make the best decisions at each step of the way.
And first of all, how did you learn how to, as a CEO, because developers are pretty much introvert. You're a developer as well. And we find it even more difficult than normal people, because developers were not all that normal, to speak in front of people, but also speaking in front of a microphone that gives you the imposter syndrome. It's pretty difficult and unusual. I've been hosting events, even sometimes for 1,000 people, and I feel comfortable about doing that. But speaking to a microphone felt really weird the first episode, especially when recording the intros at night, right? And so
Yeah.
and during the pandemic, maybe I was getting a little bit crazy. But how did you learn? How did you, nurture that skill and grow it naturally?
So I actually did theater um,
All right.
all through high school and at university. In fact, I have a dual major. I have two undergrad degrees, one in computer science and another in theater. And a lot of what I did, especially in university, was more as we started a improv group and then a sketch comedy group. And that sketch comedy group was primarily video production. And so as I progressed, I more and more moved into video and audio and producing. And so this is actually a really great outlet for me. Speaking at events, doing the podcast, Upcase and the videos that we did there, even though I didn't appear on a lot of those videos, I was sort of behind the scenes producing, executive producing, that kind of thing. It's been a great outlet for me, and using that other skill set that I have and that other passion that I have.
That's actually something I wanted to touch right now, which is some things that you think you've done right from the get-go. Because we usually take a lot of really bad decisions in fields that we're not very comfortable, right? Maybe not in development, but launching a podcast is like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, we're just
Yeah.
learning as we're going, right? And the way we learn best as developers is by developing, right? So launching a podcast should be like doing podcast, not actually reading on it or
Right.
of course I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. But if you were to start your podcast again right now, well, like, what are the three things that you would start doing to get it right from the get-go? Is it something that you might be able to reutilize from your early days at your podcast?
Well, the funny thing about our podcast, particularly Giant Robots Smashing into Other Giant Robots, is that it's been going for 8 years now, and it is not the same as it was when we first started it. So we started, first thing was we're talking about ourselves, we're interviewing the Thoughtbot CTO and having a technical conversation, and we're talking about design and the client work we're doing. And then we started having guests on, and we're talking about their work and interviewing them and their history and their founding stories. That lasted for a couple of years. And then we transitioned and we went through a whole year and a half, 2-year period where we were talking about the products that we were developing. Mm-hmm. And we were running Upcase, which was a SaaS product. We were running FormKeep, which was a SaaS product. Yep. And we were talking about growing and interviewing those. And then we had one of the co-founders of Drip, which is a email marketing platform, join us as a co-host and talk about their product for 6 months, I think. And then Ben, shortly after that, decided to leave Thoughtbot after, I think, 6 years. And so I took over as host and went back to the interview format. And we did that for 2.5 years. And now Lindsay joined me, our chief marketing officer, as a co-host. And now we're following along rather than having random people interviewed on every episode. We asked 3 different companies to work with us on a monthly basis. So Lindsay and I are doing a show where we take a topic like sales or marketing or productivity, and we talk about it from a Thoughtbot perspective. And then we interview the 3 other founders that are at different stages of their companies on that topic. And so every month we're visiting with the same companies and hearing their take on that topic in an interview format. And so it's a very, it's different, but it's still sort of the spirit of the same show, because we wanted one of the downsides of interviewing someone different every time is you lack sort of that through line and that familiarity that you get when you have a set of co-hosts that are just the same every week. And we wanted to bring a little bit of that continuity to the show. So that's a very long way of saying, I don't know that you are going to be able to get it right off the bat, but you also, I think you have to have like an idea and then you have to go with it, and you have to be willing to change and experiment and that kind of thing, just like on our products. And I think that is, people look at Thoughtbot and they look at our playbook and they look at what we produce and what we put out there publicly, and they, from the outside, see it as like sort of a snapshot in time and be like, wow, Thoughtbot really has it buttoned down and they know exactly what the best way to do things is, and that kind of thing. And that couldn't be further from the truth. What we're actually doing is we're just very willing to iterate and change over time. And we're very good about publishing the best way that we know how now, in a pretty professional, structured way of sharing. And so it seems like we really know what we're doing, but what we're actually really good at is continuous improvement and iteration. And that is both on the products that we're building, but also, we treat the projects that we run as products as well. And so we apply those same techniques. We're very reflective on how we work. We run retrospectives and that kind of thing. And then we come up with action items, and we come up with changes that we want to make, and then we actually implement them.
Yeah, I'm not saying we should compare our chapter 1 to your chapter 10, because you're 20 years old as a company, almost 10 years old as a podcast. So of course we should take things with a different perspective, right? But there are some common items that probably help. I really like the whole idea of the podcast that's been evolving a lot. And I could tell, I remember listening to one podcast would be about, Rails and Webpack, whatever. Then there was maybe the next one was design. I'm not that interested in design, so I might have skipped it perhaps, but then business. And nowadays it's completely different from what it used to be. So my next question is, what keeps it alive nowadays? So why are still you doing it? What keeps the fire alive?
Well, so I'll just be perfectly honest. Changing it is what keeps it alive. The reason why I wanted Lindsay to join as a co-host wasn't just to bring a different voice, more diversity onto the show, but to keep it fresh and to keep myself interested in doing it. It's hard to do a show week after week for years on end and to stay excited and to stay interested in it and that kind of thing. And so, after 2.5 years of doing it solo, it made sense to, okay, what's next? How can I keep this fresh and interesting and not get bored with it? And so having Lindsay join, and then after about a year, changing the format to be following along with other thing. Even after a year, it was sort of like, how can we bring, sort of level this up and bring a level of continuity? What do we think is missing? So that's what keeps it going, is because I love talking to people. I love hearing their stories. I love digging into it, but doing it week after week can be tedious. So at the core is the love of talking to people and finding out their stories and that kind of thing. But what keeps it going is, intentionally trying to keep it fresh.
Yeah, actually, so motivation is probably one of the things, right? You run out of motivation, but it's easier to run out of motivation when things are going south. And I don't know if that's been your case. I mean, I might remember 1 or 2 episodes where, the speaker, the guest didn't show up or something like that. How did you solve these situations? Because when this happens, it's like, oh man, this happens once, might happen twice. Then you start getting a little bit more, deceived by the project, or maybe you lose the kind of like the magic. Do you keep like evergreen content buffered, or you record anyways? Because I assume it's very difficult to start with a weekly dedication right from the get-go.
Yeah, we started with weekly from the get-go, but because we haven't ever talked about timely things very much, like we've had a few episodes which was like, oh, WWDC happened the next week we're talking about that. But for the most part, what we do is we record as many episodes as we can, basically.
Yeah.
And that then helps us keep on track when a guest falls off, or so we're recording every week, sometimes multiple times a week, especially in the beginning. And so that was the way that we would keep. The other thing that accounts for is taking vacations and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't be fair if I didn't credit our producer, Tom. So a few years in, we added someone to the team in the producer role who took care of scheduling guests and making sure that we stayed on schedule and had enough episodes. And we could justify adding Tom because we also were doing Upcase at the time, which was heavy video production as well. So Tom was able to do video editing and filming and everything, and then also do podcast editing and scheduling. So what we basically do is we use a Trello board and every episode is a card on the board, and it flows through scheduling, pre-production, post-production, it's posted, that kind of thing. And by having every episode be a card with a date, we can keep track of what, we're recording episodes as much as possible. And then we're using the due dates on the Trello cards to say, okay, this one is scheduled to go out on this day. This one's scheduled to go out on this day. And by that way, we can make sure that we're recording as many episodes as we can, and that they're scheduled, that we are hitting every week on the schedule.
Yeah, but I assume at the beginning it was not like that. I'm also pleasantly surprised that you don't have a crazy integration with a clusterfuck of no-code tools. Like nowadays, it's like Typeform, whatever, Airtable, and everything is very complicated. They're automated through Zapier. So you're still keeping it the old school method of Trello, right?
Yeah. In the beginning, what we did was we actually recorded. See, this is the thing. When you've been doing something for so long, you go through periods where you're like, let's try this, let's try that. So there was a period of time where we were basically recording four episodes in a week. And then that was the month of episodes. And so we recorded 1 week out of every month. We did the 4 episodes, and then we didn't need to record the rest of the month. And that worked for a period of time, but it can be intensive to record 4 episodes in a week. And so then we started to spread it out again. So I guess that's a long way of saying, like, what's going to work for your schedule and that kind of thing is probably varied based on your life and what you can bring to the table and that kind of thing. The important thing is to be a lot of people who do podcasts, and I'm a firm believer in this, you've got to be consistent. So whether it be every week or every 2 weeks, every month monthly is a little too inconsistent, even if you're regularly scheduled. But that's a key component to building an audience and having people listen, is that they know to expect an episode and that they know that more are coming. And so that consistency is pretty important. So the way that and it's just a belief that I have and other people who do podcasts have. So the way that we've done that is we establish a day of the week. So Giant Robots comes out on a specific day of the week. We've changed what day of the week that is over time, but we just said Giant Robots is on Mondays. It's coming out on Mondays. And so the episode will be recorded and queued up and whatever, but scheduled to come out on that Monday. And then, each of our podcasts, Bike Shed, that kind of thing, have a specific day of the week that they come out.
Consistency is really key. I wholeheartedly agree with that, because we've been hosting the offline events since April 2014, at least once per month. And people ask me, like, how do you do it? How do you do it in December, August, when Barcelona is empty? I was like, there's always this individual satisfaction in each one event, right? So we've talked about the let's say the bigger scheme of things, the motivation of keeping the podcast alive over the years. but what keeps you going episode after episode? What do you find in every episode that keeps you going to the next one, keeps you looking forward to the next interview or content that you record?
So I want to make good shows, right? And so, I wouldn't say I'm the best interviewer. Like there's, in the world, there's obviously people who are incredible interviewers, but I actually really like trying to, so I prep for the interviews, thinking through, doing some research and thinking through, how I'm going to flow the questions. And I actually have a little trick, which is I actually do quite a bit of research before the episodes. I don't ask questions that I don't think I know the answer to. So this is a little, so I actually, almost all of the questions, particularly when it was just me doing the interviews, I would really do enough research to be able to ask questions and have a sense of what I thought the answer was. And my goal and sort of like the game that I was playing myself, or like the goal that kept me motivated to do each episode, was to like try to dig into something and expose something that was meaningful to the person who I was interviewing, or to the audience. And that sort of quest of being able to do that. And when I came away from an episode, you have ups and downs when you're interviewing. Interviewers are inconsistent. Each one is bringing something different to the table, that kind of thing. So, the episodes where I walked away and I feel like I wasn't able to get to that point are the ones where I say, like, the episode is fine. As a listener, you might not be able, you might not even tell, but as a host and as a person interviewing, I know because I had planned out or had a sense of what I was trying to get to and what I was trying to peel away, and get to the point of where the person I'm interviewing is being authentic and that kind of thing. I know when we didn't achieve that. And that is the game I'm sort of playing with myself when I'm trying to interview, is like to get to that point. And if I can do that, I feel really good about the interview. And so that's the sort of sub game that I'm playing for each episode, of like prepping and trying to get to it, and then doing it and showing up for the show and trying to get to it. That's what motivates me for each individual episode.
Yeah, one of the things I really like, or the kick I get after each event, or sometimes during the event, is I'm interviewing somebody and then it's like, wow, I never thought about that. I'm learning this, making new connections in my brain as I go through the interview, right?
Right.
Perhaps if you're interviewing people who are not that interesting, you cannot learn from why interviewing them in the first place, right? And one of the things I really like is the way that you very subtly manage to, when you interview, I think you're a great interviewer, but you also get to talk about Thoughtbot in your interviews, right? Not a lot of people do that. Most people would just, ask questions, but they would never weigh in with their own answer, which is perhaps sometimes as important or even more insightful, perhaps, that what the other person is saying. How do you calibrate that? Did that come naturally, or somebody told you, man, we should talk more about Thoughtbot because we're not saying enough things?
It came naturally. So it's funny because it's just sort of what I had as a vision, but so I would plan out the interviews. I would do research on the person and figure out what we were going to do. And it sounds counterintuitive, but even though I would have that plan, before we started recording, I would say to the person, I think the best interviews are ones where it's not just me asking you questions, it's more of a conversation.
Correct.
Now, the actual interview is mostly me asking questions of them, but trying to start that conversation, not intentionally so that I can share, but and talk about Thoughtbot from a marketing perspective. I just think that by letting them ask me questions, or by me exposing something about Thoughtbot, it's allowing them to then feel like they're not the only one who's sharing. And I think that it hopefully makes them be able to be more honest, because they feel like it's a back and forth and that I'm being honest and I'm sharing as well. And so if I can reveal something or show something or talk about Thoughtbot, I think it allows them to open up more and share about themselves as well.
And then it's not a purely reactive question, right? Questioning, because it's not like I'm answering a question and they are just reacting to whatever I've got to ask, but perhaps it keeps them even more engaged, or I don't know, showing some sort of disagreement as well. Because most of the things I always like to say, like, my interviews are not a fucking massage, because like a lot of people just go there and they ask really generic questions, not a lot of preparations, like, oh, tell us about your company, how big is your company, how many employees have you got? It's like, dude, you can, that information is on Crunchbase or on Wikipedia, whatever. Just let's ask something insightful that not only the marketing people can answer, like ask from the real, meat and potatoes that only a founder or a CEO can answer. So in that regard, what have you done? What's perhaps maybe this approach that you're mentioning, it can also backfire on you, right? Because the other person maybe is not a great speaker, or they come to a point where like they're not react very well, or they're just super interesting, but they cannot talk on a microphone. What's the most awkward the moment that you've found interviewing people for the podcast?
So, you can tell. So our episodes are not a fixed length.
Right. That's a good answer.
The most awkward ones are probably the shortest episodes, because we get on and we start recording, and I've got my questions prepared and I'm asking questions, and like I'm getting one word responses. It's like, did you know what you were like? Did you want to be on the show? What are you here for? If you're just answering, yep, no, so, I don't want to, throw any individual guests under the bus.
Don't worry, nobody.
There have been those episodes where we start recording and it's just like, I'm not getting anything. It's like, well, why are you even here? And so then we're like, there's two ways to go about that. And actually I've done both, and it really depends on the person. Some cases, actually, I've cut it sort of short, and we just like, it's a short episode and that kind of thing. And I've just said, thank you for coming. And, it's great. You did a great job. And then we release the episode. And sometimes we've recorded actually extra long, and I don't, do this too much because it's investing time and when it's not worth it. But there is another strategy where, we'll be recording for 45, 50 minutes for someone who's not really, and I've really had to push them. Yeah. And the episode comes out a lot better because then we cut it down to 25 minutes, 30 minutes. And we are only taking their best parts and the parts where we got to something meaningful, after really having to walk them through and spend a lot of time almost feeding them, like, can you tell me more about that? And really digging in. And then cutting out my part of where I'm asking them to expand more.
And actually, have you ever recorded any episode you ended up not releasing? Because that could be.
Yeah, we have. That's pretty rare. I think we've only done that once or twice. It's more common, especially in the early days, where we were doing interviews with people that were coming on the show, and then they would say something, like we would go into an area that it turned out that because I think it's good, I got them to expose something that then ultimately they weren't comfortable sharing. And so we talked about it. Usually like right after the end of recording, they'd be like, you know what, that part I'm not really comfortable sharing that or whatever. And I would say like, no problem, we won't include it in the episode. So that was more common.
few more questions just before we wrap this up, because it's getting super interesting. But I was wondering, so maybe it also evolved over the years, as I think it might be the case. But in which area do you think the podcast is helping Thoughtbot the most? In hiring, branding, lead generation? I don't know.
It definitely evolved over the years. In the beginning, it was more directed at designers and developers in our community, and it probably helped with hiring and reputation the most.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it is more about lead generation and community. There was a period of time where what we were doing was we were actually inviting. So if I was having a conversation with a founder or a CTO at a company about potentially working with Thoughtbot, it was a little trick we were doing to be like, you have a really interesting story. I'd love for you to come on the podcast. That was a great way to keep the relationship and conversation going, and also like elevate their status and make them feel good, and hopefully help close the sale. And so that there was a period of time where we're not doing that anymore, because now we're following along with the three companies. So we're not rotating, we're not changing out the guests and doing random guests.
Yeah.
But there was a period of time where we were doing that. So now it's just about sharing and more on the lead generation side.
And the developers tell you something like, "Oh, you sold out because now you don't talk about development anymore, just purely about open source and whatever." That never happened, because
no, it did happen, which is okay. Well, not everyone. Actually, to go back, there was probably one mistake that we made, which is we tend not to be very marketing driven or very audience, like wanting to intentionally grow the audience. I think we could have done more to cross promote the Bike Shed and the other shows more in Giant Robots, because I don't think everyone understood that we had a venue for development, and it's another show. And so if you want that, you're better off listening and going over to the other show. And if you don't like the direction and the conversation that we're talking about here, it's totally okay. We're actually not leaving you behind. We're just sort of, creating two different channels. And I think we could have done more of that to make it very clear that that wasn't going away. It was just somewhere else. And if you wanted that, it was okay to stop listening to this, go listen to that.
All right. And one of the other questions I've got is, and I'm being part of the problem here, we're creating a new podcast just like everybody else right now. Everybody's jumping on the podcast trend. It's kind of uncomfortable saying no to so many new podcasts. Yeah. So I really appreciate you being here, because we're a really new podcast, but I really think that we'll be able to grow it into a pretty successful one. But like, how do you see the future of podcasting? Because right now there's a lot of people joining the trend, but I know for a fact they're not going to be here in 6 months. So how do you see this sort of new boom in the competition?
I think it's, people don't do it. Well, okay. There's probably a certain group of people who do it because they want a successful show, or they want to do it for business reasons. And those are the people that won't last. Because if you don't do it because you actually want to do it, and then I just know from experience, it's a grind, especially if you're doing a weekly show or even every 2 weeks. It's a lot of work to do. And so if you don't really love it, or if you're not getting something from it, it's going to be hard to keep it up. So I'm all for everyone who's inspired, who is excited to start a show. There's more than enough things to, and for new people to find. And the people that love it and stick with it, they'll grow an audience over time as people find their show and other shows go away and that kind of thing. I'm a big believer in sort of the free market of podcasts and open podcasts, and more is better. And then over time, shows that deserve to have an audience and be popular and everything, I think find it. So.
Yeah, no, in a sense, it reminds me of the events industry, right? When we started in
Mm-hmm.
2014, we're not the first ones, but here, Barcelona, the startup ecosystem in 2014 started to kind of like take off. It became something more serious. And then over the years, we would see new events being created or new meetups created every week. But, we've been doing it for 7 years now, almost.
Right.
And we've seen a lot of them disappear along the way, which is a shame. But not everybody. I think that's part of the equation here. Is one of them is consistency, as you mentioned. The other one is community. And I think a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
don't get community right. You get it right because you're doing a lot of open source and your blog and sharing and speaking at events and all of that. So therefore, people will flock naturally to your new thing, which is because they become your true fans, which is something that we're experiencing right now, which is not a big number we're having, but from the get-go, 50, 60 people in every episode was good start for us, especially because we had no experience, but we've been hosting events, we've been talking here and there, hosted a blog for many, many years. So I think that's the other part that other people are missing. Like you don't have a track
Yes.
record behind. So I don't know if your opinion
That's
is.
actually a really, really good point. This is true not just for podcasts. It's true for basically any product that you're building. Even if you're building a mobile app and you want, it's a recipe app.
Yeah.
If you're not building, the best way to make that recipe app successful is to build a community around that topic and build that reputation and that expertise. So start a blog about recipes and great recipes. Start going on forums and being a part of that community, and that's how then people find your app and you become your fans and make your product successful. It's a really great strategy. The same applies to podcasts. If you're just doing the podcast, it's going to be really hard to build an audience. If your podcast is part of a community and an ecosystem and a reputation that you're building, you're going to be able to build that podcast audience a lot better.
Great. One last question and a challenge for you, Chad. So the question is, we like to make failure more accessible to people. We like to destigmatize failure. So what's the biggest tech fuck up that you've ever done? Can be the costliest. It can be just big in terms of something you screwed like really badly. Everybody has wiped out action data.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my kids are knocking on the window, asking a question about, they're building a giant spaceship out of a big box. Right. And they found the old Wii controllers and they want to know whether they can use them on the spaceship. And it doesn't matter that I'm recording a podcast and a video show. They need an answer.
Not working. Working from home is not working.
So the biggest, I don't know that I've ever told this story publicly before, but one of our first clients at Thoughtbot, when we were first getting started out, we, contacted everyone that we knew that owned businesses and might need software. And one of those people was my father-in-law. He owns a music online store and brick and mortar store, sells instruments, and it's a pretty significant business, especially in his area of the country. And he used very old, outdated DOS-based POS software and e-commerce software. It was all outdated, and we're talking to him, got excited about building a whole new system. And it was a big project. So part of the idea was get other music stores and everything to buy into the product. We knew that it was a big project, but we were just getting started out. We didn't understand really just how big it was. And I think we said we could launch the first version in 3 months in product, and switch over his store to it. That was way optimistic, especially switching a running business over to new software. And so we grossly underestimated it. At the time, we were also willing, and we're just getting started, so we were doing fixed contracts. That also made sense in the context of what we were doing is like, okay, you pay this amount, and then we'll get other music stores and they'll all pay that amount, and we'll be building the software and the business together. And he was going to, try to get his other music stores that he knew of to buy in. And we weren't able to do that either. A lot of other stores didn't want to switch over, that kind of thing. So after 6 months, a year, they still weren't fully switched over. We didn't have fully working software. We didn't have new stores buying in. So we were still working on that initial 3 months of pay. And so we were really underwater on the project, and stuck in a spot where, this was my father-in-law. And when you're in that situation, and you probably know, even if it's not your family, you feel an intense obligation to work through it and to make it right, because it is your fault for underestimating and not running the project appropriately, given what you now know. It is your fault. And so you feel an intense obligation to fix that problem in a lot of those situations. And then layer on the fact that it's family. So in that scenario, we worked like a whole nother year trying to get things in order, grow the feature set, get new people on board, everything, all for no more money. And it was after about that amount of time, we just couldn't continue like that. Like, we were doing him a disservice, and we were doing Thoughtbot a disservice. And eventually we just needed to have the hard conversation about how we were both holding each other back. And I ended up, I think we just compromised, and we paid back half of what we were originally paid, and decided to just sort of walk away from the whole thing and write off all of the losses. And so not only was that a big tech screw up, but it was a big Thoughtbot screw up, and really early learning about everything, how the pitfalls of fixed bid projects, the pitfalls of underestimating, and the pitfalls of trying to make something, to structure something where, it's a big project, huge project, and people can't afford to do it. So trying to finagle a way of doing it that doesn't actually match. Like, by building a whole other business around trying to get music stores to sign on, that wasn't the business that we had. We had a consulting company, a software development company as the business. We weren't a product company. And so trying to, make something happen in a way that was that didn't match the business that we actually had, we were setting ourselves up for failure as well. And so now we take all those lessons, and we really avoid that. If people can't truly afford what we're going to be doing, it's probably a good indicator that they shouldn't be doing it, and we shouldn't be doing it. Those kinds of things.
Is that the project that inspired the blog post why we don't do fixed bid projects?
Probably, yes. Yeah.
I remember that one. It's like, this is the one that I've been sending to our clients. Like, why don't we do fixed bid projects? We could try to mimic that into our blog post. It's like, no, we'll use Thoughtbots because it's so great. Like, I will not be able to rewrite it in our view. We share 100% we're saying there. And to wrap up, here's my challenge for you. You said that you like your guests to ask you questions. So what's your question for me?
So being based in Spain and running the in-person events in Spain, like, do you feel like you're held back at all by being so locally centric? Where are your clients based?
That's a good question. Thank you for that. This is the first time I asked somebody to do this, but I like to challenge my guests. We're based in Barcelona. Our clients are mostly outside of Spain, just because for 4 years we had the website only in English. Mm-hmm. And so I've got 4 active clients in the US, the Nordics, so Sweden, Germany, even though it's not Nordics, UK, then a couple on the other side of the world. But Spain's really not very representative because of the lack of Rails over here. but also because they only do fixed bid projects. It's changing, but the culture of fixed bid projects here is just too big. Like everybody does fixed bid, or how you call that, body shopping. We don't do neither. So it's kind of difficult that we work with local companies, but we're more than happy to with working with companies overseas, in spite of, the not overlapping and all of that. But yeah, it's a challenge. But I think the language can like filter it, and yeah, it's not. I don't think it's holding us back. On the contrary, it's a very good time zone to be working with Asia. We've got a client in freaking Australia. And then people on the West Coast. So it's very not the most convenient because of brutal time zone differences, but at least it's in the center of everything. So like,
well, then is the flip side also true? You're very embedded in the community where you are. Does it frustrate you that you don't have more local clients?
Not really. I mean, it would be great, and it's great when we can do it, because then normally when we mention companies from abroad, they're like, to our potential clients, like, well, I don't know any of these companies. Of course not, even though they might be big companies. But luckily enough, we work for one of the biggest consultancies in Spain, and that's like, oh, you work for these guys, and through them we work for Real Madrid, which is the second biggest football club in the world, and some other like high level profile companies. So it's great. All right, that was great. You're great at improvising as well. So it's not only about preparing. There's a big part of improvising as well in interviews, and good outcome for the challenge. Well, thank you very much, Chad. All the best success for you, Thoughtbot, the Giant Robots podcast, and everything you're doing. It's a successful job, tremendous effort. Been hugely inspired by you and obviously other companies, but Thoughtbot is a great. When I wear these proudly. Thank you very much.
Yes, I appreciate the fact that this is going to be a video show as well. So you get the nice Thoughtbot shirt. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.